Welcome back to Avenues of Awakening Medicine Journey. Today we're going to take a look at the history of Western medicine. Don't worry, it's a huge history. I'm going to do a very, very brief review of it. Compared to what I could do, this could be an entire podcast on itself, really. But for me, this just seemed like a logical jumping off point since we're still early in medicine journey, just to begin with the tradition that I'm familiar with. Growing up, I came out of Western medicine, and it's only in my adult life that I've gotten to know these other traditions. So it seemed logical to me to start with Western medicine, of which I started to realize I actually knew very little. So happily, I found this book called A Short History of Medicine by Steve Parker, and I've been using this as a source to study and to prepare these notes. So let's get into it. In future episodes, I'll probably continue to have a very short scripted, produced section to introduce the topic before we move on to our guest interview and conversation. But today I do not have a guest, so I'm going to be my own guest, which means in this case, the scripted section will be a good bit longer. So I hope you find it as interesting as I do. I'm sure I'm going to gloss over the vast majority of fascinating topics that have occurred in the history. But what does happen is that I have emerged with a much, much more profound appreciation and understanding of where this tradition comes out of. So if, like me, you've not ever learned too much about this, I hope you find this interesting and learn something along the way. So let's get started. Diving into the history, one of the first misconceptions I had was that Western medicine didn't really have much going for it until maybe the early Renaissance. We think of the medieval, seemingly willy-nilly amputations and bloodletting, miracle cures, elixirs, and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is that we have millennia of records from civilizations all over the world, documenting not only the existence of medicine practitioners and healers, but specific systematized records of diseases, healing plants and recipes, treatments, professional guidelines, and surgical procedures. So let's go to the way back machine to pre-recorded history. Here we have ample archaeological evidence from around the world of the practice of medicine, from cave paintings demonstrating the use of herbs to oral traditions and examples from existing remote tribes. There's also analysis of plant material in the teeth of skeletal remains that show extensive practice and knowledge of native local plants, with traces of things like willow bark, yarrow, and chamomile, all of which have known medicinal properties and often are not eaten just nutritionally. We've even found people who were frozen and buried in ice more than 5,000 years ago, who had medicine pouches with them almost as a normal thing to bring with you during excursions. And there's specific evidence of the ability to set broken bones, to use clay or mud as a cast, to dress wounds with poultices of herbs or bandages. There was even dentistry and minor surgeries. Later on, we have actual artifacts of drills used for trepanning, which basically just opened a hole in the skull to relieve pressure, migraines, or perhaps release evil spirits. Not pleasant to think about, but impressive. What this showed me was that not only was there rudimentary use of herbs for healing, but commonplace use and knowledge of medicines and surgical practices. Once we start getting into documented history, we know about Imhotep, a priest-physician in ancient Egypt who gradually became deified. And then here's the great part. We have the 3,600-year-old papyrus, which impressed me by having detailed and rationalized accounts of wounds and trauma intervention, along with 48 case histories, including examination, diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis, all on this one papyrus. Of course, there are other papyri at the time describing spells and incantations and how you apply those to particular disease diagnoses. That was pretty cool too, and it's why we refer to these practitioners as priest-physicians. This also introduces an interesting dialectic. one of the things you'll find woven throughout the history of medicine and healing is this sort of convergence and divergence of the spirit realm with the physical realm. In the original archetypes, we might think about the tribal village with the king or chief having political and military power, and then the shaman or medicine man or witch doctor having these sort of priestly healing and divination side of things. And these were two very distinct positions in history. And the theme I kept noticing is this overlap of the spiritual and the physical realm, which obviously has been a point of theological debate for all of history. But you find this overlap embodied in the person of the healer. And so originally we have a lot of overlap with this priest-physician type. But at times throughout this history, we find a distinction of these classes, where you have the priest function separate from the medicine function, even in the ancient era. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. So coming out of Egypt, we have a systematic approach to physical medical treatment, including surgeries. Now, when we get to ancient Greece and Hippocrates is when the medicine as we know it is sort of systematized. Everyone's probably heard of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, that medical students to this day use as a model for their professional ethic. Now, Hippocrates wasn't mythological. We know where he lived. We know where he's from. He's from the Greek island of Kos. I'm probably saying that wrong. Could be Kos. The Greek island of Kos. And he worked in the decades surrounding 400 BC, which makes him contemporary with Socrates. Unfortunately, I actually realized I never knew what he did or why he was particularly important besides the Hippocratic Oath. It turns out that we hold Hippocrates as the linchpin to formalize and propagate the archetype of what a good doctor would be, while also moving us away from these supernatural interpretations into a more purely physical attribution of disease. Finally, he also systematized the process for patient examinations and treatment, clinical record keeping, prognosis, and follow-up. We know this in part because we have 60 written documents of various lengths and topics attributed to him. Of course, some of these documents may be from students or later practitioners who wrote under his name, but we also know that some of these students studied anatomy via corpse dissection, and another who founded a medical school by 250 BC. We also know Hippocrates for propagating the cornerstone of medical theory for the next 2,000 years. Have you heard of the four humors? That's blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. Each of these are associated with one of the four elements, air, earth, fire, and water, respectively, which in turn have their own qualities and associations with disease groupings. And so what happens is we correlate certain diagnoses with an excess of one of these humors, and there's corresponding foods and interventions to restore balance. And thus, the model of health is needing these things to be balanced. This was interesting to me because I know we're going to see this in Ayurveda, and we're going to see this in the 5 phases of Chinese medicinal philosophy. It's very similar. A couple other things about Hippocrates. We know that he trained in the temple of Asclepius, who is the Greek god of healing. That's where we get the rod of Asclepius, the medical symbol with the snake curled around the rod. One of the mythological daughters of Asclepius was Hygeia, which gave us the word hygiene, and another one of his daughters was named Panacea, which is the word for the sort of universal medicine. So a lot of these medical terms originate from the Greek. Interestingly, Hippocrates apparently was imprisoned for 20 years for threatening the status and worldview of the priest class. This seems to me like a timely conversation for our podcast, the relationship of health and power. One of the quotes attributed to him is, "Let food be your medicine and medicine your food." So that's relating the notion of medicine to what we're taking into our bodies, right? Of course, I was thinking about this quote and I'm like, well, probably food was of better quality back then. Just speculating. Let's wrap it up with Hippocrates. Big picture, he did a lot to formalize the notion of medicine, And I think the Hippocratic Oath sort of encapsulates this summation of what the archetype of a good doctor would be. For maintaining health and cleanliness, repeat visits with your patients, having upstanding morality and professional ethic, and of course, doing no harm. This was the turning point when we could start to recognize medicine as we know it. So we've gone through Egypt, we've gone through Greece. Let's move up to Rome. The main person of this era was Galen of Pergamon, who was in the Roman era, contemporary to about 180 AD and the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. He traveled widely and studied at the medical school in Alexandria. And actually, he cut his teeth professionally by treating wounded gladiators, and then he eventually got promoted to the emperor's personal physician in Rome. Again, I knew Galen as a semi-mythological doctor who I assumed we vaguely knew about. Scant records of this person who traveled around at the time, treating people. I could not have been more incorrect. He probably left behind 6 or 7 million words, of which we have 3 million words of his surviving to this day. To this day. Unbelievable. We know that Galen continued to interpret disease via the four humors, and then he expanded upon that into human typology. So you may have heard of sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic personality types. Well, these all correlate to the four humors. I also know we're going to see similar types of mapping in other traditions. So by the time of Galen, we have a vast physician's toolkit with surgical tools that I found very impressive. A variety of knives, scalpels, hooks, ways of suturing, not to mention catheters and prostheses. By the way, Galen wrote about surgery and anatomy, diet, fitness, respiration, and bloodletting, and a vast array of other topics. So much that his influence extended for another 1,400 years, until the Renaissance began to fill in or revise his weak spots, such as a far superior mapping of human anatomy by the mid-1500s, and the discovery of blood circulation in the 1620s, which finally replaced Galen's obsolete ideas about blood being generated and consumed. So those were pretty glaring misconceptions, but it goes to show how far his influence reached, which was well over a millennium. Okay, so we have these 3 primary roots of Western medicine. We have Egypt with the priest physicians who rationalized the study of disease. We have Hippocrates, who really sort of systematized medical practice and set the example of what and how a physician should act. And then we have Galen, who was a very broad polymath who left behind loads of writings and a lot of records that set the tone for the next 1,400 years. Just in ancient times, we've already set the way of observing, of documenting, of treating, of having case histories. People are getting trained in medical schools, be that in the temple or later specific institutions for the study of medicine. Certainly by 250 BC, medicine was a known profession with the exchange of ideas and innovations in the field of tools and medicines, practices, and treatments. It would be incomplete not to mention the serious focus on public health and hygiene in the Roman era. Unbelievable. So I really had to throw out my understanding of medical history. Probably the single most fascinating thing that I did not realize was how much recorded documentation we have about this. Then we get to the Dark Ages. Remember how we talked about this back and forth relationship with purely spiritual attribution versus the physical attribution of disease? What we find coming out of the Roman era is the gradual resurgence of spiritual explanations for disease, along with the devolution of medical knowledge and practice. But let's rewind for just a second. Politically speaking, when we see the Roman Empire collapse, what it really means is the interconnection between places and the circulation of ideas and materials devolved into a much more localized and impoverished kind of community life, which in turn was planting the seeds of feudalism, basically local lords that then gradually started to reconsolidate back into kingdoms. During this time, knowledge reverted to the monastery. And if you've never read the book The Swerve by Stephen Greenblatt, it's a phenomenal explanation of the sort of prototypical and also a specific capstone rediscovery of ancient texts locked away in these libraries of the monastery. So I recommend that book if you want the story of sort of how did the reawakening happen. That's also where all these very texts that we still have from Galen and Hippocrates and many others either were archived in the monasteries or they were translated and traveled mostly east to the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and then the Islamic Empire as that developed, and then came back across and were retranslated. So we have these series of translations, many versions of some texts attributed to those ancient physicians. Okay, so let's remap it. We've had the priest witch doctor that sort of transmuted into the doctor physician around the time of, Hippocrates and Galen. Then we have this resurgence of this spiritual understanding of illness. Now, coming into the Middle Ages, we have the apothecary type, which, by the way, comes from the Greek word for storehouse. So we consider them as a repository of herbs and remedies of varying degrees of efficacy, I suppose you could say. One innovation we do have, though, coming out of the Christian tradition is the hospital, where patients can come for care, not only the ill, but the destitute, the sick, the elderly, even students and the feeble-minded. So this umbrella institute for people who are suffering or needy starts to gain maturity, which includes this infusion of compassionate care provided by monastics and the church. Of course, we also have bloodletting with incisions or leeches as the major treatment option. This is because, as we talked about, the four humors perspective continued throughout this era. In this case, blood became the primary humor that most people thought drove illness, and especially thinking that you had an excess of blood, so people felt they needed to drain it. And again, people still believe that blood is generated in the body and consumed in the extremities. And so we developed a sort of system of appropriate locations and amounts of bloodletting, usually from a vein, because arteries would, let's just say it wouldn't go so well. Some interventions called for longer and shorter durations, some distal or distant limbs of the body, and others more proximal, depending on what the intervention called for to restore that proper balance. There was even a map of how these different parts were interrelated. This is actually a common theme I've seen in other forms of traditional medicine. Now we get to one of my favorite topics, which is alchemy. While alchemy is thousands of years old, it reemerged in the sort of early Islamic era with people like Jabir around 750 AD. Alchemy is sort of the precursor to chemistry, with a lot of overlap in its methods of investigation. There's also a lot of that infusion relating to spiritual development and transformation. So in a lot of ways, these alchemists are actually similar to the priest-physician. We might call it the mystic chemist. Again, we have typing of the elements now. In this case, we're seeing that Jabir is classifying his working elements as a spirit, which means you can boil it and it will evaporate. Metals, which are malleable, and then the non-malleable items, which basically means you can pulverize them and turn them into powders. So we see powders, malleable solids, and liquids that can become vapor. The alchemist's toolkit. Likewise, this is where we get into mercury and sulfur and arsenic as fascinating compounds, not just because of their smell, but they could form compounds with medicinal value. It's interesting to note that these are the same elements that we might think of in the cesspools of hell. I wonder why. Anyway, just like the ancients, we have existing texts from alchemists in France, in Germany, in England, Italy, significant practitioners of alchemy. And they're really getting fascinated about this interaction of inorganic with organic substances. Of course, this often still includes magic, ritual, and the occult, and those also have associated books. Interestingly, even those things start to gain hints of the scientific method, methods of rationalizing how spells work, how incantations and rituals should be used in association, perhaps with herbs and other medical treatments. So I'm finding almost this parallel of the physical sciences and their development with the sort of spiritual sciences, if you will, at least having a sort of parallel track. Fundamentally, alchemy is about transformation. You're trying to transform something's purity, something's value, or something's functionality. So this could be physical transformation, or in the more esoteric spiritual realm, this means spiritual transformation approaching purity. That actually reminds me of the Holy Grail, right? In the sort of allegorical, metaphorical sense. And these realms, these physical and spiritual realms, are once again very well interconnected, seeking the elixir of life, the philosopher's stone, along with the spiritual perfection. But here, something else struck me, and I think this is a key point of this episode. Having veered so strongly and having such success in the physical realm now, with medicine and healing, by understanding anatomy and circulation and cellular biology, and now DNA, and even more precise than that, molecular chemistry and gene therapies and all this stuff. It's fascinating. It's fundamental. But it seems that it has been so divested of realms that we might term like psychological, psychic, energetic, or spiritual. And I think a lot of what we're approaching right now is how to reconcile and rationalize these zones of intervention with a broader view of healing. And I think that's what this podcast season fundamentally will be about. By the 1600s, Galen's big picture had largely gone by the wayside, although some of his ideas were still being taught into the 1800s. Alchemy evolved into chemistry, medicine and medical intervention shift gears into becoming much more affiliated with the scientific method, with modern anatomy leading to discoveries and improvements across the board and increasingly specific disciplines. We're now entering the modern era, which is where I will stop. That's the Western story. To me, it's the story of what's permissible. How does the prevailing philosophy of reality affect how we are allowed to attribute illness, how we're allowed to look at the body? And I think there's actually value in all of these eras, but we have to find the right application of these values. And a lot of the times, they were very limiting throughout history, right? But it makes me wonder, what is not allowed right now by the value set we have? Let's take a much quicker look at the roots of a few other traditions that are going to weave into this season, hopefully with dedicated episodes. Let's start off with traditional Eastern medicine, which I got exposed to when I worked in the administration of the Yuan Institute outside of Philadelphia, which is a Buddhist training center as well as an acupuncture and herbalist school. Mostly, I'm just going to note the similarities with a couple key points. Again, this is the briefest of summaries. So in Eastern, we have a book called Huangdi Neijing, which translates to the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon from about 2,000 years ago. This book describes a system that may be over 4,000 years old. This text lays out so many of the principles of traditional Eastern medicine that survive to this day. How to evaluate the pulse, the bowels, the tongue, the practice of acupuncture, and other related techniques. It talks about qi, about yin and yang, about the 5 phases, which is sort of the Chinese elemental system that likewise must be kept in balance. We also have specific examples of the formalization of medical traditions. Right around the time of Galen, we have someone named Zhang Zhongjin who published an extensive manual on disease and their treatments. Just after 1600 AD, the Korean doctor Hao Jun canonized Korean medicine as distinct from Chinese, and Japan also had their own such text, such as Ishimpo from 984 and Ketekishu in the 1500s. So taken together, the Chinese model persisted and propagated throughout Eastern Asia for more than a millennium. There is a Chinese saying that I think demonstrates the ethic of Eastern medicine. It goes like this: the superior doctor prevents illness. The mediocre doctor attends to impending illness. And the inferior doctor treats actual sickness. In other words, it's placing a value on maintaining and preserving health and well-being. This is such an essential perspective, and one that I think is extremely relevant to our modern life. We'll definitely come back to this in future episodes. Turning to Ayurveda, we see a similar story when Charaka rationalized and codified the philosophy about 2,300 years ago into a text called the Charaka Samhita. It's funny to me, we're seeing so much being rationalized and codified and written between 500 BC and 500 AD across all these cultures, and really probably even a smaller window than that, like 300 or 400 BC to 300 to 400 AD. It's very fascinating. For those of you who've done a little Ayurveda, you know about the 3 doshas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, which are elemental concepts roughly analogous to the Greek humors. And just like our other traditions, what we're seeing is the need to preserve or restore balance and harmony of these within the body, which in turn connects to the broader environment. So let's turn to the North American indigenous culture. This is probably really the origin of the phrase medicine journey. This is where, I'm a little sensitive to appropriating this phrase, but it feels like we don't really have an adequate alternative with this sort of broad meaning but specific connotation. I guess I could call it healing journey, but healing is not exactly the bullseye in this case. Medicine in the indigenous sense is a better term for it, which covers broader techniques not only for healing, but general health, well-being, and integration. In that case of medicine man or woman, you have the notion of a guide, the notion of a teacher, the value placed on altered states of consciousness, be that via drumming or ritual or psychoactive medicines, for example, or even things like tobacco. You also have a lot of emphasis on smoke, not to mention extensive knowledge of native herbs. I even read here that there's an herbal remedy that 10 years ago was determined to have very specific healing benefits that exceeded anything we'd found before. I think for treating a condition related to having styes in the eye. It was just way better than anything we had. And then there's similar discoveries coming out of Africa and West Asia. Now in those places, Africa and West Asia, we have a little more ritualistic acknowledgement of the spirit realm, again combined with herbs. You have things like divination and even exorcism. You have more attention paid to the effects of transgressions and needing to atone or make amends for something. And as an aside, I actually think we've lost those values, almost throwing out the baby with the bathwater in terms of some of those practices. I really do. So I do want to examine those and chat with some people about priest work. All right, I'll wrap up the survey there. I'm sure I've brutally skipped and butchered names and pronunciations and key points and momentous components, and I'm sure I've oversimplified, almost by definition. But again, this is just my general level 1 review of the pre-modern history of medicine. And we'll definitely revisit some of these topics and many others in future episodes. Now, I did want to mention some of my observations and takeaways from this review. First, I have deeply increased respect for the wisdom traditions we have in medicine. And these were all like 2,000 years ago or more, right? All of these traditions are very much being propagated and synthesized right now across cultures and traditions with a common thread about the need for a healthy balance. We also have this dynamic tension between the physical healer, the doctor, the herbalist, the apothecary, over to people like the shaman, the priest, the medicine man, the witch doctor. There's this constant back and forth among these realms that I think is a fascinating dynamic in history. And I think you're seeing a restoration of some of these spiritual principles. And so I hope this season is an investigation into that dynamic. So that's my brief history and a broad intro. If you made it through all of that, I really appreciate you hanging in there, and I hope you learned some great things just like I did. Actually, on the far side of it, I'm really glad to have gone through all of that because there's a lot of topics that I think are going to have a bearing on the rest of this season when we get into some of those different modalities, when we get into some of the conversations about what is the meaning of health, nutrition, your medicine is food, food is medicine, as well as the notions of what it means to be a good physician, as well as the things about keeping different systems in balance. And then the relationship of medicine and power and social standing. So all of these are going to tie back in. And it's funny to me that we've seen these themes repeat throughout history. And I think we're coming up with a whole new reevaluation and rationalization of how to approach healing and medicine that hopefully integrates the best of a lot of these different traditions. So thank you. If you like what we're doing, please remember to like and subscribe on the YouTube channel. And if you really want to show a gesture of support, you could drop a few coins in the donation page, which I've linked in the show notes below. As you probably know, this takes a long time to produce, and any sort of gesture like that would put a little wind at my back to keep making these, which I would love to do. Regardless, I hope you join us next time where we're going to start to bring in some guest speakers on topics like nutrition, eco-mythology, dreamwork, and other topics. So I really look forward to those. So thank you again for watching and listening. In the meantime, stay healthy, stay well, and make sure to treat yourself right. All the best.